The bank teller at the Wells Fargo branch on Peachtree Street in Atlanta looked up at the woman standing at the counter and thought she had made a mistake. The woman had been holding a sealed manila envelope that had been folded into her apron pocket. The envelope had been stained with one small water ring from the condensation of a bottle of sweet tea that had been pressed against it on the bus ride from the west side. The envelope had not contained a deposit slip. The envelope had not contained a check. The envelope had contained $50,112 in cash, the entire contents of the safety deposit box that had been found that morning by the manager of the cleaning crew at the small clinic where the woman had been working the night shift for the last 3 years. The teller had looked at the envelope. The teller had looked at the woman. The woman had been wearing the same flour-dusted apron she had been wearing on every Tuesday and Thursday morning for 3 years. The teller had asked the woman to confirm the amount. The woman had nodded. The woman had said, "That is not my money, and I am here to return it." The teller had not been able to process the transaction because she had never seen a customer return $50,000. The manager of the branch had been called. The manager had come out with tears in her eyes. The manager had asked the woman how she had found the envelope. The woman had said she had been cleaning the office of the doctor who had rented the safety deposit box, and the envelope had been on the floor underneath a small desk that had not been moved in 3 years. The manager had asked the woman her name. The woman had said Mary Mitchell. The manager had said, "Mrs. Mitchell, please sit down. We need to call the doctor who owned the box." The doctor had been a wealthy cardiologist named Dr. Lawrence who had owned the clinic for 20 years and who had died 2 years earlier in a small accident on the highway. The doctor had never married. The doctor had no children. The doctor's estate had been going through probate. The safety deposit box had been one of the assets of the estate that the executor had not yet inventoried. The manila envelope had contained the entire contents of the box because the executor had been removing items in small batches and had left the cash that day because the executor had been called away to a meeting before the box had been emptied. The envelope had been on the floor of the doctor's office for 2 years. The clinic had been rented out to a small dermatology practice in the meantime. The envelope had been missed by the cleaners 3 different times because the cleaners had been moving around the office in the dark on a Friday night. The envelope had been on the floor waiting for the right woman to find it. Mary Mitchell had found the envelope on a Tuesday morning at 5:30 in the morning. The envelope had been on the floor under a small mahogany desk where the doctor had written his prescriptions for 20 years. The desk had been moved by the cleaners of the dermatology practice on a Friday afternoon 2 weeks earlier. The cleaners had not looked underneath the desk. Mary Mitchell had been the next cleaner to enter the office after the move. Mary Mitchell had been on her knees with a flashlight. Mary Mitchell had seen the manila envelope stained with one small water ring. Mary Mitchell had picked up the envelope because picking up objects from floors had been the work she had been doing for 9 years. Mary Mitchell had opened the envelope because envelopes on clinic floors were almost always trash. Mary Mitchell had looked inside the envelope and saw the cash and walked out of the clinic at 5:40 in the morning because the bus to the bank was leaving at 6 and she had to catch it. If this story reached your heart tonight, kindly tap the subscribe button and let me tell you how Mary Mitchell arrived at that Tuesday morning. But to understand how she arrived at that moment, we have to travel back 12 years to the summer she first signed his name on her own paper. We have to travel back further, to the morning she first knelt beside her grandmother's bed in a small house on the south side of Atlanta, and her grandmother had whispered the prayer that would follow her for the rest of her life. Mary had been raised by her grandmother. Her grandmother's name had been Mama Ruth. Mama Ruth had been a domestic worker for 38 years. Mama Ruth had been the kind of woman who could wake at 4 in the morning and have breakfast on the table by 5, and have the small house swept by 6, and have the laundry on the line by 8. Mama Ruth had been the kind of woman who could read a Bible verse out loud 3 times, and make it sound like the verse had been written for the listener sitting beside her. Mama Ruth had given Mary 3 things the week before she died. The first had been a small gold cross on a char. The cross had belonged to Mary's mother, who had died at the age of 19 in a small house fire when Mary had been 3 years old. The cross had been pressed into Mary's palm by Mama Ruth on a Wednesday afternoon. The second had been a small handwritten prayer, 5 lines long, written in Mama Ruth's careful, slow handwriting on a piece of yellow legal paper. The prayer had begun with the words, "Lord, keep this girl steady when the world wobbles." The prayer had ended with the words, "And bring her back to this kitchen when she has forgotten where home is." The third had been a small photograph of Mama Ruth standing beside Mary's mother at the wedding of Mary's aunt in the summer of 1983. The photograph had been folded into a small envelope with the prayer and the cross. Mama Ruth had said, "Keep these 3 things in your apron pocket for the rest of your life, baby, and the apron will hold you when nothing else can." Mary had been 14 years old. Mary had wept. Mary had placed the 3 things in her apron pocket. Mary had not removed them in 15 years. Mary had grown up. Mary had fallen in love with a man named Andre at the age of 19. Andre had been a man who wore suits to work and who came home smelling of coffee and who had the kind of smile that made Mary's grandmother raise a warning finger at the dinner table the first night Andre had eaten at the family home. Mama Ruth had not been rude. Mama Ruth had only said, "Baby, smiles do not pay rent." Andre had smiled wider. Andre had taken Mary out to dinner the next night. Andre had married Mary 6 months later in a small ceremony at the courthouse. The ceremony had been attended by 8 people. Mary had worn a white dress she had bought at a thrift store for $12. Andre had worn his blue suit. They had moved into a small 1-bedroom apartment on the south side. They had dreamed of a small house. They had dreamed of 2 children. They had dreamed of a marriage that would last the rest of their lives. The marriage had lasted 3 years before the wound had begun. The first cruelty had been small. Andre had begun to ask who Mary had spoken to on the phone during the day. He had asked her why her coworker had called her during the lunch hour. He had asked her what the call had been about. He had asked her the same questions every evening until Mary had stopped answering the phone during the lunch hour. The second cruelty had been about money. Andre had given Mary a small monthly allowance for the household. The allowance had been less than the cost of 3 grocery bags. Mary had asked if the allowance could be raised. Andre had explained that good wives do not ask for more than their husbands can give. Drop a single comment telling me which moment of this story made the tears come for you. The third cruelty had been about Mama Ruth. Andre had whispered one evening in the kitchen that Mama Ruth had been an uneducated woman who had been trying to raise an uneducated granddaughter. He had said a real wife would learn to read a financial spreadsheet. He had said a real wife would learn to cook the way his mother cooked. Mary had wept quietly in the bathroom that night. She had taken her grandmother's cross off her neck. She had placed the cross inside her apron pocket with the prayer and the photograph. She had not removed the 3 objects from her apron pocket in 15 years. The fourth cruelty had been about her friends. Mary had a friend from high school named Camille. Camille had been a Sunday school teacher at a small church on the south side. Mary had asked Andre if Camille could visit one afternoon. Andre had explained that good wives do not need friends from high school. Mary had walked away from the conversation. Mary had not asked for visitors again that year. The fifth cruelty had been about her work. Mary had been working as a clerk at the small clinic for 2 years. Andre had told her that good wives do not need to work outside the home because good husbands provide for their wives. Mary had been asked to resign from the clinic at the end of the month. She had resigned. She had wept in the bathroom of the clinic on her last day. The clinic manager had been a kind woman named Denise. Denise had taken Mary to lunch on Mary's last day. Denise had told Mary that the door would always be open. The door had been the same door Mary had walked through 3 years later to pick up the manila envelope. The sixth cruelty had been about her body. Andre had told her one evening that she had been gaining weight and that good wives maintain their appearance for their husbands. Mary had begun to skip meals. She had begun to skip lunch on Mondays and Wednesdays. She had been losing weight slowly. She had been dizzy by the end of each week. She had not told Andre she was dizzy. The seventh cruelty had been the cruelest of all. Andre had told her one Saturday morning that she would never be a mother because a woman who could not manage a household could never manage a child. Mary had not spoken for 3 days after that morning. She had walked to the small park near their apartment every afternoon. She had stood beside the swings. She had watched mothers and their children. She had wept quietly in the small park. She had not told Andre where she had been walking. 2 months later she had discovered she was pregnant. The pregnancy had been confirmed at the small clinic on the south side by Dr. Lawrence himself. Dr. Lawrence had been a kind man who had been running the clinic for 12 years. Dr. Lawrence had said, "Mrs. Mitchell, you are going to be a mother." Mary had wept at the small clinic. Dr. Lawrence had handed her a tissue. Dr. Lawrence had said, "My dear, your baby is fine." The baby had been a girl. Mary had named the baby Grace, because Grace had been the only word that had been running through her mind when the doctor had handed her the small ultrasound photograph. The wound came the year Grace turned 3. Andre had hired a housekeeper without telling Mary. The housekeeper had taken over the cooking, the cleaning, the laundry, and the grocery shopping. Mary had been reduced to a guest in her own home. She had asked Andre why he had hired a housekeeper. Andre had explained that good wives have housekeepers. Andre had explained that her biscuits had been a poor reflection of his mother's biscuits. Mary had wept in the bathroom that night. She had held Grace in her arms while she wept. Grace had been too young to understand why her mother was crying. Grace had only known that her mother had been holding her tighter than usual. The wound went deeper the year Grace turned 4. Andre had filed for divorce on a Monday morning. The divorce papers had been delivered by a courier while Mary had been making breakfast in the kitchen. The divorce papers had used the word abandonment. The divorce papers had claimed that Mary had abandoned Andre by refusing to be his wife. The divorce papers had used the word neglect. The divorce papers had claimed that Mary had neglected her duties because she had been crying in the bathroom instead of ironing his shirts. Andre had not given her the chance to read the papers in private. Andre had read the papers out loud to her at the kitchen counter, while Grace had been eating her toast at the small table beside them. Andre had changed the locks on the house the following Wednesday. Andre had called a locksmith at work. The locksmith had changed every lock in the house, including the lock on the kitchen door. Mary had arrived home that afternoon with Grace on her hip, and the housekeeper had met her at the door and told her she had been locked out. Mary had asked to speak with Andre. Andre had been in court, signing papers that had taken away her right to enter her own home. Andre had given her $300 in cash and one suitcase. The suitcase had contained her clothes, 2 pairs of shoes, a small Bible, and the apron with the 3 objects still in the pocket, the cross, the prayer, the photograph. Andre had called her on the phone that evening. He had told her the $300 had been a generous settlement. He had told her she would see Grace on alternating weekends because good wives do not get custody of children. He had told her she should be grateful he had not called the police. Mary had not slept that night. She had walked the streets of Atlanta with Grace on her hip and the suitcase in her left hand and $300 in her right hand, and she had wept in the quiet back of a bus station on the west side where a kind woman had offered her a bench. The kind woman had slipped a small container of soup into her hand. The kind woman had not asked any questions. The kind woman had only walked into the night and disappeared into the city as if she had been an answer to a prayer. Mary had nodded even after she had left, because she had been taught by Mama Ruth that angels sometimes come by way of strangers. Share this story with one friend this week. You never know whose kitchen it may steady. The custody battle had been the longest battle of Mary's life. Andre had hired 2 lawyers out of a small trust his father had left him. Andre had produced a photograph of the locked house as evidence that Mary could not be trusted with a home. Andre had produced a photograph of the bus station bench as evidence that Mary could not be trusted with a daughter. Andre had produced the apron pocket with the cross and the prayer and the photograph as evidence that Mary had been carrying sentiment instead of savings. The judge had been a stern woman named Judge Elena Maynard. Judge Maynard had looked at the evidence. She had looked at Mary's hands. She had looked at Grace, who had been holding onto Mary's apron. She had granted joint custody. She had said that joint custody was the only fair arrangement. She had not said that joint custody was that would never fully heal. Grace had grown. Grace had gone to school. Grace had gone to the small elementary school on the south side where Mama Ruth had taught Sunday school for many years. Grace had worn the same pair of shoes for 2 years, the same black sneakers with a small pink star on the side. The sneakers had been one size too small since she was 6. She had not asked for new ones. She had not cried about the size. Grace had taken care of her mother more than a child her age was supposed to. Grace had made her mother tea at 4 in the morning before Mary left for the night shift at the clinic. Grace had set the small alarm clock on the dresser. Grace had walked her mother to the bus stop on Tuesday mornings before Mary took the bus to the clinic for the 3 cleaning jobs she had secured after the divorce. Mary had lost her apartment when Grace was 6. She had moved into a friend's couch on the north side. The friend's name had been Denise. Denise had been a single mother with 2 teenage daughters who worked the night shift at a hospital. Denise had opened her door to Mary on a Friday afternoon without asking a single question. Denise had simply moved her second daughter into the second bedroom, and she had given Mary and Grace the 3rd bedroom at the back of the apartment. She had made them a pot of collard greens and cornbread that evening. She had not asked for rent. She had only asked Mary to help her daughter with her math homework at the kitchen table 3 nights a week. Mary had baked biscuits at Denise's kitchen every Sunday morning. The biscuits had been eaten by Denise's daughters, by Denise, by Mary, by Grace, and by 2 of Denise's neighbors who had walked in one Sunday and asked what the smell was. The smell had been the smell of flour, the smell of cinnamon, the smell of Mama Ruth's kitchen, the smell of hope. And that was how the cleaning work at the clinic had grown into a small empire of 3 cleaning jobs, by the time Grace was 8. And the cleaning jobs had grown into a baking side hustle that Mary had run from Denise's kitchen every Sunday morning. And the baking had grown into a reputation in the neighborhood that had reached the manager of the clinic on a Tuesday afternoon in October. The manager had been a kind woman named Ms. Tanya. Ms. Tanya had been running the clinic for 21 years. Ms. Tanya had been the kind of manager who could spot a woman with a steady back and a quiet heart from across the room. Ms. Tanya had offered Mary the night cleaning job at the clinic for 43 hours a week. The job had paid $16 an hour. The take-home pay had been enough to rent a small one-bedroom apartment on the south side of Atlanta. Ms. Tanya had offered the job on a Tuesday afternoon. Mary had taken the job. Mary had walked home. Mary had set the small alarm clock on the dresser. Mary had wept quietly because the prayer Mama Ruth had whispered over her bed every night of her childhood had been answered in the form of a cleaning job at a clinic. Mary had worked the night shift at the clinic from 10 at night until 6 in the morning 6 nights a week. Grace had been in school during those hours. Grace had walked herself to the bus stop and back on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Grace had walked herself to the small diner 3 blocks east of their apartment, where a kind waitress named Beatrice had given Grace a plate of scrambled eggs and toast for $2 every school morning. Beatrice had been the kind of woman who could read a child's face and know when the child had not eaten breakfast. Beatrice had not charged Grace for the breakfast on the days Grace had come in wearing the same small pink star sneakers that had been one size too small for 2 years. The morning Mary had found the envelope had been a Tuesday morning. Mary had been working the night shift at the clinic the night before. Mary had come home at 6:30 in the morning. Mary had woken Grace up for school. Mary had made Grace a bowl of oatmeal. Mary had walked Grace to the bus stop. Mary had come back to the apartment. Mary had taken off her apron. Mary had not yet placed the apron in the closet because she had not yet realized that the envelope had been missing from the office. Mary had fallen asleep on the couch. Mary had slept for 43 minutes. Mary had woken up. Mary had walked back to the clinic because she had left her flashlight behind under the desk in Dr. Lawrence's old office. Mary had walked back to the clinic at 5:30 that morning. Mary had opened the office with the spare key Ms. Tanya had given her. Mary had walked to the desk in Dr. Lawrence's old office. Mary had knelt beneath the desk to retrieve the flashlight. Mary had seen the manila envelope beneath the desk. Mary had picked up the envelope. Mary had opened the envelope. Mary had looked inside the envelope. Mary had seen the cash. Mary had not known what the cash was. Mary had only known that the cash did not belong to her. Mary had walked out of the clinic at 5:40 because the bus to the bank was leaving at 6 and she had to catch it. The bus had been the 42 bus on the South Side route. The bus had taken 43 minutes to reach the Wells Fargo branch on Peachtree Street. Mary had been holding the envelope in her lap the entire ride. Mary had not opened the envelope. Mary had walked into the branch at 6:40 in the morning. Mary had walked to the counter. Mary had stood at the counter. The teller had looked at Mary. The teller had thought Mary had made a mistake. The teller had asked Mary to confirm the amount. Mary had nodded. Mary had said she was there to return the cash. The manager of the branch had come out. The manager had asked Mary to sit down. The manager had called the executor of Dr. Lawrence's estate. The executor had been a small law firm on the north side. The executor had sent a paralegal to the branch. The paralegal had confirmed that the cash did belong to the estate of Dr. Lawrence. The paralegal had asked Mary how she had found the cash. Mary had told the paralegal she had found the cash under the desk in Dr. Lawrence's old office. The paralegal had asked Mary to sign a small statement confirming the return. Mary had signed the statement. The manager of the branch had been standing behind the paralegal. The manager had been wiping her eyes. The manager had asked Mary to wait. The manager had walked back into her office. The manager had called a number that had been engraved on a small plaque on the wall of her office, the number of Dr. Lawrence's closest friend. Dr. Lawrence's closest friend had been a billionaire named Glenn Forsyth. Glenn Forsyth had been the founder of a small technology company that had been valued at $300 million. Glenn Forsyth had been the kind of billionaire who attended Sunday school at the small church on the south side, where Mama Ruth had taught for many years. Glenn Forsyth had known Mary for 3 years, because Mary had been cleaning Dr. Lawrence's office every Tuesday and Thursday morning. Glenn Forsyth had been the kind of billionaire who noticed the floor under the desk where the envelope had rested. Glenn Forsyth had arrived at the branch at 7:30 in the morning. Glenn Forsyth had been wearing a dark blue suit. Glenn Forsyth had walked to the small chair where Mary had been waiting. Glenn Forsyth had not introduced himself. Glenn Forsyth had only asked Mary to confirm what had happened. Mary had confirmed. Glenn Forsyth had not said another word. Glenn Forsyth had walked out of the branch at 7:45. Glenn Forsyth had driven his black Mercedes to Mary's apartment on the south side. Glenn Forsyth had knocked on the door at 8:30 in the morning. Grace had answered the door because Mary had been at work. Glenn Forsyth had introduced himself to Grace. Grace had been 7 years old. Grace had been wearing the same small pink star sneakers. Glenn Forsyth had asked Grace if her mother was home. Grace had said her mother was at work. Glenn Forsyth had knelt on the porch beside Grace. Glenn Forsyth had asked Grace if he could come back at 5 o'clock when her mother got home. Grace had said, "Yes, sir, you can come back at 5. Glenn Forsyth had left the porch. Glenn Forsyth had returned at 5 o'clock. Mary had been sitting at the small table with Grace when the knock had come. Mary had opened the door. Glenn Forsyth had been standing on the porch. Glenn Forsyth had said, "Mrs. Mitchell, I am Glenn Forsyth. I have known you for 3 years because I have visited Dr. Lawrence's clinic twice a month and I have seen you clean his office. I have never spoken to you because I am learning from your silence. I am here today because you returned $50,000 that did not belong to you. I want to ask you one question. I want to ask you why." Mary had invited Glenn inside. Grace had been sitting at the small table eating toast. Mary had sat across from Glenn. Mary had told Glenn why she had returned the cash. Mary had not been dramatic. Mary had not been eloquent. Mary had only said, "Mr. Forsyth, that cash was not mine. My grandmother raised me to believe that what is not yours should not be in your pocket. The apron I am wearing has not left my body for 15 years. The cross in the pocket my mother held when I was 3. The prayer my grandmother wrote when I was 14, the photograph of my mother at my aunt's wedding. The apron has held me when nothing else can. My grandmother's prayer is in the pocket. The prayer says, 'Bring this girl back to the kitchen when she has forgotten where home is.' The kitchen is this small kitchen. The home is this small apartment. I am home. I do not forget where home is. The cash was not mine. I returned it." Glenn had not interrupted her. Glenn had listened to every word. Glenn had asked one follow-up question. Glenn had asked Mary what she wanted to do with the next 10 years of her life. Mary had answered. Mary had said she wanted to finish the small baking side hustle she had been running on Sundays. Mary had said she wanted to open a small bakery for the women in the neighborhood. Mary had said she wanted her daughter to go to a school where she could be a student instead of a small business partner at the age of 7. Glenn had nodded. Glenn had opened his leather bag. Glenn had taken out a single envelope. Glenn had placed the envelope on the small table in front of Mary. Glenn had said the envelope contained the deed to a small commercial kitchen on the south side of Atlanta, 3 blocks east of the small church where Mama Ruth had taught. Glenn had said the deed was made out in Mary's name. Glenn had said the deed was the seed of a small bakery that would be called Mama Ruth's Biscuits. The name Mama Ruth had used when she had been baking biscuits for the women of the church on Sunday afternoons. Mary had taken the envelope. Mary had not opened the envelope. Mary had wept quietly. Glenn had not wept with her. Glenn had only nodded. Glenn had stood up. Glenn had walked to the door. Glenn had paused at the door. Glenn had said, "Mrs. Mitchell, the bakery is yours, the deed is yours, the flour is yours, the oven is yours, the name is yours, the apron is yours. I am not giving you a gift. I am returning to you what belonged to you before the world forgot it." Mary had not known what to say. Mary had only said, "Thank you." Glenn had walked out of the apartment. Mary had stood at the door with the envelope in her hand. Grace had been eating her toast at the small table. Grace had not asked what the envelope was. Grace had only said, "Mama, are you going to keep baking?" Mary had said yes. Grace had smiled. Grace had said, "I will help you on Sundays." The bakery had opened 3 months later. The bakery had been a small white building with a green awning above the door. The sign above the door had read Mama Ruth's Biscuits in wooden letters. The first morning the bakery had been open, 6 customers had come. The second morning, 8 customers had come. By the end of the first month, the bakery had been making enough money to send Grace to a small private school on the south side. By the end of the first year, the bakery had been serving 96 customers a day. By the end of the second year, the bakery had been featured on the local news. The bakery had been covered by 3 local newspapers. The bakery had been visited by a food blogger from Atlanta who had written a small piece that had been read by 140,000 people by the following Tuesday. And then Glenn Forsyth had called a second time. Glenn had called because the local news had aired the piece about the bakery. Glenn had called because Glenn had been quietly watching the bakery grow for 2 years. Glenn had asked Mary to meet him at the Wells Fargo branch on Peachtree Street. Glenn had asked Mary to bring the apron. Glenn had met Mary at the branch on a Tuesday morning at 6:14 in the morning. Glenn had been standing at the counter where Mary had stood 14 months earlier. Glenn had invited Mary to sit at the small table in the manager's office. Glenn had opened his leather bag. Glenn had taken out a second envelope. Glenn had placed the envelope on the table. Glenn had said the envelope contained a check for $1 million. Glenn had said the check was a gift. Glenn had said the gift was Mary's to do with as she wished. Glenn had said the gift did not come with strings. Glenn had said the gift was simply the return of what had been owed. Mary had not taken the check. Mary had taken the cross out of her apron pocket. Mary had taken the prayer out of her apron pocket. Mary had taken the photograph out of her apron pocket. Mary had placed the 3 objects on the small table beside the envelope. Mary had asked Glenn one question. Mary had not asked for the check. Mary had asked for something larger. Mary had said, "Mr. Forsyth, I do not want the check, I do want what the check could do. I want you to start a foundation. I want you to start a foundation that helps 1,000 single mothers who are standing in their kitchens right now with $11 in their hands, and a sick child in the next room, and a refrigerator that holds 4 eggs and a half-gallon of milk. I want the foundation to open small bakeries in every city where single mothers are baking from their homes and need a commercial kitchen to scale the recipe. I want the foundation to pay the licensing fee for the ordinance. I want the foundation to donate the packaging and the flour and the butter for the first year. I want the foundation to place 1,000 single mom cookies on the shelves next to the Fortune 500 cookies and to print the name of the mom on the front of the box. I want the foundation to do this for 10 years. I want you to do this because God used this apron to feed me, and I am asking God to use your foundation to feed the next woman who is standing in her kitchen right now." Glenn had not answered that day. Glenn had gone back to his car. Glenn had driven to his office on the north side. Glenn had called Susan, the woman who had been running the supplier diversity program at Walmart. Glenn had talked for 43 minutes. Glenn had told Susan about Mary's request. Glenn had told Susan that this was the first time in 7 years a supplier had asked Walmart for something larger than a contract. Susan had said yes. Susan had called Mary the next day. Mary had been on the kitchen floor again. The wooden spoon had been resting against the bowl. The flour had been in the small bowl. The apron had been on Mary's body. Mary had taken the call. Mary had cried quietly because the prayer Mama Ruth had whispered into the flour every Sunday morning of her life had been answered in the form of a foundation that would feed 1,000 mothers. The foundation had been announced 3 months later. The foundation had been called the Mama Ruth Foundation for Mothers Baking in Their Kitchens. The foundation had been a partnership between Glenn Forsyth's Foundation, the National Baptist Convention, the local Catholic diocese, and the local Methodist conferences. The foundation had opened church kitchens in 17 cities in the first year. The foundation had been open to any single mother who had been baking from her home kitchen for at least 6 months. The foundation had provided the commercial oven, the commercial mixer, the small packaging equipment, the license fee, the inspection fee, and a small payment to the church for the hours the kitchen had been in use. The foundation had placed the mother's cookies on the shelves with her name on the front of the box. The foundation had been the largest foundation for single mothers that had ever been launched in the South. The cross had been on the front cover of the company-wide memorandum that had announced the foundation to every partner in the country. The cross had been on the front of every box of cookies that had been sold in the foundation. The cross had been the spine of the foundation. The cross had been the thing the foundation could not manufacture and could not patent. Mary had answered every interview about the foundation. Mary had answered with the same words in every interview. Mary had said, "My grandmother raised me on a prayer that said, bring this girl back to the kitchen when she has forgotten where home is. The kitchen is the chapel. The prayer is the foundation. The apron is the robe. The spoon is the bell. The recipe is the scripture. The daughter is the answer." Andre had called Mary 6 weeks after the announcement. Andre had asked to meet her at a small diner on the west side of Atlanta. Andre had not been wearing one of his $3,000 suits. Andre had been wearing a polo shirt and a pair of khakis. Andre had been sitting in the third booth from the door. Mary had arrived. Mary had been wearing the same flour-dusted apron she had been wearing every weekday morning for 2 years. Andre had not interrupted her when she had walked in. Andre had only looked at her for a long moment. Andre had apologized. Andre had apologized for the divorce. Andre had apologized for the locks. Andre had apologized for the custody battle. Andre had apologized for the cruelty he had poured into the home. Andre had not apologized because he had wanted Mary back. Andre had not apologized because he had wanted the bakery. Andre had apologized because he had finally understood the cost of what he had done. Mary had listened to the apology in silence. Mary had not interrupted him. Mary had not raised her voice. Mary had not insulted him. Mary had not reminded him of the things he had done. Mary had only remembered the prayer Mama Ruth had whispered over biscuits every Sunday morning of her life, the prayer that had said the biscuits should feed the people who needed feeding, and that the people who needed feeding had often been the ones who had caused the hunger. Mary had told Andre the same words she had told Glenn Forsyth 14 months earlier. Mary had said the past could not be erased, but the future could be healed. Mary had said the biscuits would feed the people who needed feeding. Mary had said the kitchen would be open to anyone who wanted to come in. Mary had said his daughter would always love him. Mary had said he should not have to lose his daughter in order to find his own humility. Andre had nodded. Andre had not argued. Andre had asked Grace if he could visit the bakery on Sunday afternoons. Grace had said, "Yes, Dad, you can come to the kitchen on Sundays, and Mom will teach you how to make biscuits the way Grandma Ellie taught her." Grace had been 9 years old. Grace had not worn the small pink star sneakers in 2 years because Mary had been able to afford new shoes once. The bakery had been making enough money. Grace had been standing at the counter of the bakery that Sunday afternoon in a new pair of sneakers that had been white with a small silver star. Grace had been stirring the small bowl of flour with the wooden spoon her grandmother had given her mother. Grace had been teaching her father how to fold the dough. Andre had kneeled beside Grace. Andre had listened to his daughter. Andre had set the small kitchen timer to 45 minutes. Andre had asked his daughter why she had been wearing the same small pink star sneakers for 2 years. Grace had looked at her father. Grace had said the sneakers had mattered because the sneakers had been the promise her mother had not broken. The sneakers had been the proof that the kitchen could be built on promises kept and on prayers whispered over flour. And the foundation had reached its 1,000th mother on a Tuesday morning in the 2nd year. The 1,000th mother had been named Lola. Lola had been raising 3 children in a small apartment in Mobile. Lola had been baking cookies from her home kitchen for 9 months. Lola had been selling them at the front of a small gas station on Saturday mornings. The announcement had been made from the small church kitchen in Atlanta by a video call. The video call had shown Mary standing at the stainless steel counter. The video call had shown Lola standing at the counter in Mobile. The video call had shown Grace holding the small cross from the apron pocket that had been stored in a glass case at the foundation headquarters. The video call had ended with the 3 of them raising their crosses at the same time. The video call had been watched by 1,400,000 people by the end of the week. And so the morrow of every Sunday had been the morrow of every kindness. And the kindness had been the sound of biscuits coming out of an oven at 5 in the morning in a small kitchen on the south side of Atlanta, where the prayer had been whispered into the flour at 5 in the morning of every Sunday for 60 years. Where the apron had held Mary when nothing else could. Where the cross had been the spine. Where the daughter had been the answer. Where the recipe had been the scripture. Where the timer had been the bell. Where the kitchen had been the chapel. If this story blessed you tonight, drop a heart in the comments for the grandmother who whispered the prayer. And if you have ever returned money that was not yours, then your grandmother's prayer has already been whispered into your flour. Send this story to your mother, your sister, your best friend, anyone whose life this story may steady tonight.